What if the moments everyone laughed at years ago were never meant to be funny? And what if the real story was right in front of us the whole time? Because once you see these clips differently, you can't go back. I'm sorry it ever came to this, man, no please. Now step back for a moment and really look at one of the clips people cannot stop revisiting. In that footage, Justin Bieber is still just a teenager, and the energy around him feels oddly playful on the surface, yet deeply uncomfortable underneath. Diddy talks about spending 48 hours with him as if it is some exciting, exclusive adventure, the kind of experience a 15-year-old is supposed to be thrilled by. He presents it like a joke, like harmless celebrity banter, hinting that they are going to be hanging out and doing things that cannot really be disclosed. At the time, many people brushed it off as nothing more than another flashy industry moment, another example of fame being weird, loud, and over the top. But hearing those words now, with everything people have come to understand about power, influence, and the vulnerability of young stars, the clip lands very differently. What once sounded casual now feels unsettling, almost impossible to hear the same way twice. Diddy keeps talking, stretching out the joke and comparing the whole situation to a movie, making it seem as though Justin is being welcomed into some rare behind-the-scenes world most kids could only fantasize about. He brings up Usher, references guardianship in a way that sounds loose and strangely casual, and frames the entire thing as though this is just how the music business works. But sitting beside him is Justin, visibly young, still carrying that teenage mixture of eagerness and uncertainty. He smiles when it feels like he is expected to smile. He laughs when the room seems to call for laughter. Then almost just as quickly he goes quiet again, as if he is not fully sure how to respond or what is really expected of him. He does not look like a kid completely at ease. He looks like a kid trying to keep pace with adults who understand the rules of the room far better than he possibly could. That is the part people cannot unsee anymore. And when Joe Rogan revisited that footage, what struck him was not the humor of it, not the outrageousness of celebrity culture, but the sadness underneath it. His reaction was not to laugh it off or reduce it to another bizarre entertainment story. Instead, he seemed genuinely disturbed by what he was seeing. He looked closely at Justin's face, at the tiny hesitations, the nervous laughter, the way his expression seemed to shift as though he were trying to read the situation in real time. To Rogan, this did not look like confidence. It did not look like comfort. It looked like something else entirely. It looked like a teenager trying to survive a moment he was too young to fully understand, a kid navigating a world far larger, stranger, and more powerful than himself. That feeling only deepened when people began revisiting Justin's own words from later years. In one deeply personal reflection, Justin spoke openly about the drugs he used when he was younger, the damage those choices did to him, and the way fame entered his life before he had the emotional maturity to process it. He described how distorted everything became, how difficult it was to find normalcy after having his adolescence consumed by global stardom. He talked about where he is now, about faith, about marriage, and about trying to become a healthier, more grounded person after surviving years of pressure that most people could never imagine. There was nothing polished or performative in those words. There was pain in them. There was confusion in them. There was the voice of someone still trying to make sense of what happened to him while the whole world watched from a distance. That is why the public conversation around Justin began to shift so dramatically. For years, old clips of him with powerful adults in the music industry were treated as nothing more than awkward celebrity moments, strange interviews, odd jokes, or examples of the surreal world that fame creates. People shrugged them off because that was easier than looking too closely. But now those same clips feel heavier. They do not feel random anymore. They feel connected. They feel like fragments of a larger story that perhaps no one wanted to confront when Justin was young, profitable, and constantly being pushed into the spotlight. One of the most disturbing examples remains that footage of Diddy speaking publicly about having Justin for 48 hours. He says it with a grin, almost inviting the audience to enjoy the idea of this teenage star being absorbed into an adult world defined by power, luxury, secrecy, and status. But watching it now, Justin seems painfully young. He does not look relaxed. He does not look fully present. He looks uncertain, like someone trying to perform the version of himself the room expects while not fully understanding the meaning of what is being said around him. Rogan kept returning to that. He focused on Justin's expression, on how quickly he laughed and how quickly the laughter seemed to fade. To him, it did not read as excitement, it read as adjustment. It looked like a young person learning, moment by moment, how to behave in an environment that was already far too adult for him. As Rogan continued unpacking the clip, the conversation grew beyond that single moment. He began questioning the entire environment surrounding Justin at that age. Why was a 15-year-old in that position to begin with? Why was a child being placed in rooms full of grown men, celebrity power, industry influence, and all the unspoken pressure that comes with that world? Fame at that age does not simply change a person's schedule or opportunities. It alters the entire structure of life. It removes ordinary boundaries, the kinds of boundaries that protect most children, and replaces them with a reality where everyone wants something. In that world, your face has value, your talent has value. Your image, your access, your presence, even your silence all become part of an economy. And somehow in the middle of all that, the child is expected to know who to trust, who is safe, and where the line should be drawn. Rogan pointed out that this is exactly where things begin to break. A young artist becomes the center of attention, but without the protection, wisdom, and emotional support required to survive that level of pressure. The adults around him often understand perfectly well how the machine works. They know the leverage, the expectations, the politics, and the hidden costs, but the child does not, so he learns by watching. He follows cues, he copies confidence. He smiles when he is supposed to smile. He stays agreeable because he senses, even if only subconsciously, that being easy to work with keeps doors open. But that is not maturity, that is adaptation. And sometimes it is adaptation to an environment that should never have existed around a child in the first place. Another clip added to the growing sense of unease. In it, Diddy questions Justin about why he has not been answering his calls or spending time with him the way he used to. On the surface, it could easily be dismissed as playful teasing, the kind of casual back and forth people expect between celebrities. But when you sit with it a little longer, something about the exchange feels off. There is a subtle tension beneath the words. Justin tries to respond to explain himself, but his answers feel careful, almost measured, as if he is navigating more than just a simple conversation. The moment carries a strange weight that is hard to ignore once you notice it. Joe Rogan paused on that exact feeling. He pointed out that the discomfort does not necessarily come from what is being said outright, but from the dynamic underneath it. When a grown man, someone with significant power and influence, presses a teenager in that way, it naturally raises questions. There is a clear imbalance. One person holds status, experience, and control within the industry. The other is still a young artist, still learning, still being shaped, and likely aware that relationships like these could impact his entire future. That imbalance changes how every word is received. It changes the tone, even if the surface conversation tries to pass as casual. And that is where things begin to feel even more complicated. Because when people step back and connect that moment to the broader network of relationships surrounding Justin's early career, it paints a much bigger picture. His rise was not accidental. It was guided, shaped, and accelerated by powerful figures, major managers, and industry icons who had the ability to change his life almost instantly. Justin himself has described those early moments with a kind of innocent excitement that now feels both inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time. He talked about being flown to Atlanta by Scooter Braun, overwhelmed with anticipation, just happy to be in the room, just grateful for the chance to meet producers and be close to the kind of success he had probably only dreamed about from afar. You can almost see that version of him, young, hopeful, full of energy, stepping into a world he did not yet understand. He described seeing Usher pull up and running over to him, eager to sing, eager to impress, eager for even the smallest sign of approval. That moment alone reveals so much. Yes, he was talented. Yes, he was driven. But more than anything, he was still a kid, bright-eyed, trusting, and deeply dependent on the decisions of adults who fully understood the magnitude of what he could become. Later, Justin would recall how Usher eventually saw his videos and wanted to sign him, even as Justin Timberlake was also interested. He told the story with humor, almost like a playful memory, framing it as if 2G. Ian had stepped into a ring to compete for him. It sounds like a dream scenario, like a fairy tale version of success. But beneath that polished narrative is something far more serious. It is the story of a child being passed through rooms of immense power, where life-altering decisions are made in conversations he is not yet equipped to fully grasp. At an age when most teenagers are still discovering their identity, Justin's path was being defined at the highest levels of the entertainment industry. And the speed of it all only made it more intense. Success did not come gradually. It arrived suddenly, almost violently, reshaping his entire life in a matter of months. What looked like opportunity from the outside may also have marked the beginning of something far more complicated, a life that no longer fully belonged to him, a life guided by expectations, obligations, and pressures that extended far beyond his years. Justin himself has not hidden how dark that period eventually became. He has openly admitted that if things had continued the way they were going, he is not sure he would still be alive. He described that chapter of his life as self-destructive, painful, and deeply confusing. Those are not casual reflections. Those are the words of someone who felt himself slipping, someone who reached a point where everything, fame, money, recognition, stopped meaning anything because the internal struggle was too heavy. He spoke about the people who helped pull him back, about seeing examples of real faith, real relationships, real stability, and realizing that was the kind of life he truly wanted. That realization did not come from comfort. It came from being close enough to collapse to understand what was at stake. As Rogan continued reflecting on all of this, he connected Justin's experience to a much larger pattern within the entertainment industry. Young artists often enter that world without any real understanding of how it functions beneath the surface. They meet managers, executives, artists, and gatekeepers, people who control access, opportunity, and direction. To the outside world, it looks glamorous. It looks like success unfolding in real time. But for the young person at the center of it, it can feel overwhelming, disorienting, and at times isolating. Because when you are that young, you do not always recognize where the boundaries should be. Pressure does not always announce itself clearly. Manipulation does not always feel like manipulation in the moment. Sometimes it feels like validation, sometimes it feels like belonging, sometimes it feels like you are finally being accepted into something bigger than yourself. And that is what makes it so complex. The very things that seem like opportunities can also carry risks that are invisible at first glance. That is why Justin's later interviews carry so much more emotional weight now. One moment in particular stood out to Rogan when Justin spoke about wanting to protect younger artists, including Billie Eilish. He did not go into detail, he did not lay out a full explanation of everything he had experienced. But he did not need to. The emotion in his voice said more than any detailed account could. It was raw, immediate, and impossible to fake. Rogan sat with that moment, visibly affected by it. He pointed out something simple but powerful. People do not become that emotional about protecting others unless something has impacted them deeply. There is a kind of recognition in that emotion, a sense of seeing someone younger walking toward a world you already know too well. It is not just empathy, it is memory, it is understanding. It is the weight of experience that cannot be easily explained but can be clearly felt. And that is when everything starts to come together in a way that is hard to ignore. The old clips, the uncomfortable interactions, the admissions of pain, confusion, and substance use, the public breakdowns, the effort to rebuild a life grounded in something more stable and meaningful, the urgency in Justin's voice when he talks about protecting others. None of these pieces alone prove anything definitive. And Rogan was careful not to jump to conclusions or make accusations without evidence. But he made one thing very clear. When new information comes to light, it changes how you see everything that came before it. Once that shift happens, you cannot look at those moments the same way again. You are almost forced to reevaluate them, to question what you once accepted without hesitation. And that process is not about sensationalism. It is about responsibility. It is about being willing to ask the questions that perhaps should have been asked much earlier, especially when a young person was at the center of it all. Rogan has spoken many times about the dangers of early fame, but this time felt different. This time felt personal. He talked about how children in the spotlight are often treated as if they are already adults simply because they are successful, wealthy, and constantly visible. They are expected to handle pressure, attention, and influence as if they have already lived enough life to understand it, but they have not. They are still developing, still learning, still vulnerable in ways that success does not erase. And when things begin to fall apart, when those young artists start to struggle publicly, the reaction from the outside is often harsh and unforgiving. People do not ask what happened to them. Instead, they ask what is wrong with them. That shift in perspective is critical, especially when looking back at Justin's late teens and early 20s. For years, he was labeled as reckless, arrogant, unstable, someone out of control. The media built that narrative piece by piece, turning his struggles into entertainment. But Rogan questioned whether that narrative missed something deeper. What if those moments were not simply bad decisions made by a young celebrity who had too much too soon? What if they were signals? What if they were expressions of something internal, something unresolved, something the public could only see in fragments? What if, instead of watching a star spiral, people were actually watching a person unravel under pressure they could not fully understand? And what if the jokes, the headlines, and the criticism only made that unraveling harder to survive? At one point, Rogan said something that seemed to cut straight to the emotional core of the entire conversation. He asked people to imagine what it would actually feel like to be 15 years old, pulled away from everything familiar, and suddenly placed in rooms filled with people who hold enormous power over your future. These are not just ordinary adults. These are individuals who can transform your life overnight, who can elevate you to global fame with a single decision. And in that environment, you are expected to trust them, to follow their lead, to believe that they have your best interests at heart, because your success depends on it. For anyone, that would be overwhelming. But for a child, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes life-altering in ways that most people watching from the outside will never fully grasp. When you start looking back through that lens, other moments from that era begin to feel different too. Not because they prove anything outright, but because they reveal the kind of culture Justin was growing up inside. There were interviews filled with crude jokes, conversations that crossed personal boundaries, and public commentary about aspects of his life that should have remained private. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader environment where a young artist was constantly exposed, constantly analyzed, constantly treated as entertainment rather than as a developing human being. Even when it was framed as humor, those moments carried a deeper implication, that his boundaries did not matter as much as the spectacle he provided. And that is why so many people are now asking the same question, one that feels impossible to ignore once it has been raised. Where were the adults whose role was to protect him, not just to guide his career, not just to build his brand or maximize his success, but to genuinely protect him? Because that is the responsibility that matters most when a child enters a world like that. It is not the child's job to navigate hidden pressures, to identify subtle risks, or to defend themselves from situations they do not yet understand. That responsibility belongs to the adults in the room, the ones with experience, the ones with authority, the ones who know exactly what fame can offer and, more importantly, what it can take away. That realization is what seemed to affect Rogan the most. Not just the clips themselves, but the possibility that the system surrounding Justin may not have prioritized his well-being the way it should have. And when you connect that idea to Justin's own words about his struggles, it becomes even harder to dismiss. Justin has spoken openly about periods in his life when he was mentally and emotionally overwhelmed. Times when everything he had, money, success, possessions, felt meaningless because he was too hurt, too confused, too unwell to enjoy any of it. He described a kind of emptiness that no amount of fame could fill, a kind of pain that luxury could not distract from. It is a powerful admission because it cuts through the illusion that success automatically brings fulfillment. He made it clear that whatever healing he found did not come from material things. It came from within, from perspective, from faith, from something deeper than the external rewards people spend their lives chasing. And that contrast is striking. On one hand, a global superstar with everything the world tells you to want. On the other, a person quietly struggling in ways that are invisible to most of the people watching him. It is a reminder that public success and private suffering can exist side by side, often more closely than anyone realizes. As more stories and allegations began to surface around powerful figures in the music industry, Rogan did not rush to make definitive claims about what happened or did not happen. But he did emphasize something important. When new information comes to light, it forces you to look again. It forces you to reconsider what you once accepted without question. Those old clips, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, begin to carry more weight. The moments people overlooked start to feel more meaningful. What once felt harmless can suddenly feel complicated, layered, and worth re-examining. He made it clear that this is not about jumping to conclusions or making reckless accusations. It is about asking better questions. Questions that perhaps should have been asked years ago, especially when a young person was at the center of it all. By the end of the conversation, what stood out most was not anger or outrage for the sake of spectacle. It was something quieter, but far more powerful. It was the realization that Justin may not have had the level of protection he needed during some of the most formative years of his life. That there were adults around him who should have understood the pressure he was under, who should have recognized the risks, and who should have ensured that he was not placed in situations that felt confusing, inappropriate, or emotionally overwhelming. And if that failure existed, it is not just about one moment or one clip. It points to something larger, something systemic. It reflects an entertainment culture that often celebrates youthful success while overlooking or even ignoring the emotional cost paid by the young people at its center. And yet, despite all of that, Rogan also acknowledged something equally important. Justin is still here, he is still standing. He's still speaking openly, still trying to understand his past, still working toward building a life that feels healthier and more grounded than the one he was thrust into. That takes strength, real strength. It takes honesty to admit struggles on that scale, especially when the entire world is watching. And it takes resilience to keep moving forward when so much of your life has been lived under constant scrutiny. By the time the conversation came to a close, Rogan was not shouting or making dramatic statements. He was simply reflecting, trying to make sense of what those clips now represent. They are no longer just strange, outdated celebrity moments. They have become reminders of how easily warning signs can be overlooked when fame, money, and power are involved. Reminders that children in the spotlight are often far more vulnerable than people assume. And reminders that when someone later reveals pain, confusion, addiction, or emotional struggle, the response should not immediately be judgment. Sometimes the right response is to pause and ask what really happened behind the scenes. That is why this story continues to linger. Justin Bieber is still moving forward. He's still trying to rebuild, still trying to find peace, still trying to grow beyond the world that first defined him. And that matters, but survival does not erase the past. If anything, it makes it more important to look back with clarity and care. Because once you begin to see those moments differently, once you hear Justin's words and truly feel the emotion behind them, it no longer feels like ordinary celebrity history. It becomes something heavier, something more human, something that forces you to stop, reflect, and consider the possibility that a child standing in one of the brightest spotlights in the world may not have been protected in the way he should have been. And for Rogan, that realization was enough to shift everything, from curiosity to concern to a quiet kind of emotion people are not used to seeing from him. Now I want to hear from you. After seeing all of this, do you think people ignored the signs? Or are we only starting to understand it now? Drop your thoughts in the comments, backhand index pointing down. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, where we go beyond the surface and connect the dots, hit subscribe and stay with me. Because some stories don't end, they just start making sense.